the physical dimension is the influences of past accomplished events. And the mental aspect is how the new event incorporates them and creatively transforms them. So you have this flow from past objects into a momentary subject who then becomes an object for the future. I think it creates a more coherent way of understanding the relationship of the inner and the outer. You know, the outer is the past, so to speak, and the inner is the ongoing subjective process. Instead of saying that, well, the mind is the inside of the brain, instead you have this ongoing, very rapid flow of feeling from the body and the neural events being synthesized by the new human event, which then in turn flows back into the neural events in the body, influencing them. So you get an upward causation and a downward causation flow. The past is an emotional throb flowing into the present. You can either see them as flowing into the new moment or as the new moment pulling them in. But once it's entering into the new moment, that the new moment is transforming them as it's creating itself.
So I just want to ask you, just first question right off the bat. You mentioned a lot of thinkers in your book, and I read your book, Processing Reality. It's really good, and the questions are going to be based off of it. Yeah. So I'll just ask you straight up: what is your personal opinion out of all the studies you've done, out of your experience in your whole life? What is reality?
Ooh. I almost called my book "What is Reality," but Erwin Laszlo had taken the title a few years before me.
Oh no.
Quite irritated.
Yeah.
um, I mean, one of the reasons I loved Whitehead is because I spent a long time trying to figure that out, and I thought his and William James's approach as a I guess you'd separate what is reality from what is actuality in a way. And what's actual, for Whitehead and for William James are these momentary experiential events. And people talk about events in various ways. And so I think their particular take on it, that it's this flow of deep feeling that's synthesizing our past experience, is a particularly helpful way because it adds the subjectivity to it. Event can sound like it's not subjective. The volcano exploded. So that everything's made up of these flow of feeling events. The actuality it worked really, really well for my thinking in a number of ways we can get into, but and I guess reality would also include would include other things in actuality. It might, I guess Whitehead. The other big thing that people are emphasizing lately is potentiality, and how important potentiality is. From quantum mechanics, there's a great book by Michael Epperson about if you factor in Whitehead's approach with potentiality, it really helps a lot of the conundrums that have come up around quantum and paradoxes around quantum theory. And it's also somewhat of a mysterious thing that there's this, vast reservoir of potential, that's there. That, since we don't really experience potential directly, it's sort of perplexing. But it's anyway. There's potentiality and actuality would kind of make up the world. I think at least my world.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So you mentioned Whitehead, and we're going to get into what you mentioned in your book, this transpersonal organic cosmology. Yeah, go ahead. You want to say something?
I think I should probably add in, since my interest in Grof was the other half of of the book, that one of my great experiences was taking mind altering substances and realizing that experiencing that there's a lot more to the universe than I had anticipated in my strict scientific training as a kid way of thinking. And it was like, holy cow, there's a lot more here. And William James's last book is the plural. Have you read A Pluralistic Universe?
No.
It's a terrific book, and he
Hmm.
talks about Gustav Fechner, who was
Yeah.
was this founder of physiological psychology who had this kind of breakdown, and suddenly the whole universe was alive, and there were higher levels of consciousness, and
Hmm.
so he, and Henri Bergson, who so I sort of see him as a anticipator because Fechner is kind of like leads into Grof, and Bergson leads into Whitehead very well, but James has some kind of line to the fact that i in order to have enough, you need more. And that something like until we add in all these extra dimensions of reality, our world is going to be impoverished
Hmm.
in how we understand it and how we live it, really.
Hmm. Okay. Um, you mentioned a lot there. Yeah, Fechner is has a really interesting psychophysics, and he was inspired by Spinoza and kind of try to create this scientific framework to explain mind and matter. What is mind and matter? And um, I want to get into his details and how his model differs from Whitehead as well, because I think with him it was instantaneous. Like he would say that the brain is essentially the outside of the mind. On the inside it looks like mind, on the outside it's brain, but you extrapolate that to everything. Everything from the outside looks like material, everything from the inside looks like mind. But reading through your book, I discovered Whitehead, it's a little bit different. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
I think it is a little, in one way, it's very similar, but I think there's a difference that's important because I don't know if I can't think through problems in it with that inside outside framework that's used by a lot of different theorists. I mean, I think the idea that there's that there's a mental and a physical dimension to everything is great, but the way Whitehead sets how that works is the physical dimension is the influences of past accomplished events. And the mental aspect is how the new event incorporates them and creatively transforms them. So you have this flow from past objects into a momentary subject who then becomes an object for the future. So it's I think it creates a more coherent way of understanding the relationship of the inner and the outer. The outer is the past, so to speak, and the inner is the ongoing
Mm,
subjective process.
mm. That's
And
really
I think
interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
for understanding the mind body relationship, you get instead of saying that, well, the mind is the inside of the brain, you have this ongoing, very rapid flow of feeling from the body and the neural events being synthesized by the new human event, which then in turn is flows back into the neural events in the body, influencing them. So you get an upward causation and a downward causation flow, and which I think is really a helpful thing for
Mm,
approach for neuroscience.
mm. Okay. Um, yeah, so it sounds like it's more of the way I've thought of it as I read your book was like instead of it being horizontal or sorry, vertical, the way a lot of psychoanalysts think of it, like it's this iceberg, there's the conscious tip, and then there's the depths of the unconscious. It's kind of like sideways. It's a difference in time as opposed to location. Like,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that's exactly right.
Okay. So it's flipped.
I think I tried to use the image at one point of a Christmas tree with a great chain of being, but you turn it on its side, and you've got which has happened occasionally in my Christmas trees, but it's Yeah, yes, exactly that. There's, they're fond of using these little open arrows.
Mm,
I don't have a drawing, but here's the past flowing into the open end of the moment, and then it gets synthesized down into a little, as much as can be incorporated into the new moment, which then, flows into these new moments.
mm.
I find that visual very. I would put the visual in my book, but I don't know how to do graphics. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think a great place that the graphics would have been was some of those analogies you used to try to explain concrescence. You have this firework analogy where there's uh, a bunch of fireworks happening. Actually, you say it's inversed, and those kind of points where the firework explodes. Actually, you know what? I'll just show you the video. I actually have a video prepared. Um, so let's just watch this.
that's excellent. Yes, all those little past events flowing into the new moment that explodes into reality. That's perfect.
Yeah, the music is perfect too, but I'll mute it and we can talk over it. But yeah, so those little particles are is physical prehension, right? And the actual occasion or concrescence is the actual occasion prehending all of those physical particles, and then so how does the mental pole come in here, or is this just physical prehension?
Well, I mean, the way I think about it, because I think the physical and mental pole may be a little bit dualistic. I think Whitehead was trying to talk in terms that people could relate to. And
Hmm.
so there's mental and physical. But I just think of it as, these are past, they're physical in the sense that they're past events. They don't have any more subjective immediacy, but they're still there, as it were, somehow or other
Hmm.
in Whitehead's scheme, and they're what Whitehead likes to say that there's something about the past is an emotional throb flowing into the present. So there's this, it's emotion, it's feeling, it's energy, this, things that have happened, this, thing. So those little dots are these past energetic, emotional feeling things, and they're you can either see them as flowing into the new moment or as the new moment pulling them in. I think
Hmm.
it works both ways.
Hmm.
But one way they have a certain force of their own, if in that they present the material that's going to be drawn on for the new moment. But once it's entering into the new moment, that the new moment is transforming them as it's creating itself. So that would be what, the mental pole is, the sort of internal, so to speak,
Hmm.
transformation and any novelty that's being added.
Okay. Um, so this is essentially the basic, most fundamental building block of Whitehead's scheme, right? Is this occasion of experience, and it concresses the entire past history of the universe. That's physical prehension, and then it creates this kind of little creative uh, piece of experience, let's say.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's I think I mean that describes the fundamental sort of building blocks, but he's very big on societies and on organism.
Mm,
So that these things create societies and nexus, because obviously it's not all these microscopic things that there's chairs and there's
mm,
animals and these form complex organisms and societies that are interconnected in a very very that share certain characteristics. And the Charles Hartshorne added in the idea of the compound individual, which I think is David Griffin used, and I studied with David Griffin, so I like that idea that there's That's where you get a little closer to Fechner. You've got sort of higher, more complex levels of actual occasions.
Hmm.
So, the human level is sort of synthesizing primarily, the bodily energies, but also vaguely feeling the rest of the past.
Hmm.
And then you kind of open up the question of, are there does Earth have a compound individual? Is there a universal compound individual? Which
Hmm.
very interesting questions.
Hmm.
We kind of push into the transpersonal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're in there. I kind of have a framework, so we'll start from physics, bottom up, just how you do it in the book. But before we do that, I just want to make sure the listener, the viewer, understands just kind of the basics of Whitehead's cosmology or his metaphysics. So, okay, so we have these occasions of experience, and then they've so there's multiple occasions of experience, right? So it's like not just one that's happening. And then they form societies, right? And they all have their own kind of piece of creativity they're doing or their own experiences that they're having. Uh, and what kind of rounds them together? Because you mentioned, Whitehead's universe is social in nature, something like that. Um, so what kind of connects them together, those societies?
Well, this I think you'd call it sort of a mutual this feeling of the past is prehension is his technical term. And so they're mutually, they're feeling the same environment in a way creates creates a tissue or texture, you might say. So the actual occasions in my liver are particularly feeling the other moments of experience. I should say almost all of the occasions in the universe are non-conscious. We're not talking about liver cells being conscious, but we are talking about a certain basic feeling or sentience that just becomes more and more complex at higher levels. um, excuse me, but this I think Whitehead describes as this mutual prehension. He says creates shared eternal objects, which I find sort of obscure, but by that he means shared fundamental characteristics,
Hmm.
which then form them into sort of an identifiable organ or a society.
Hmm.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it kind of does. Yeah. Um, and this hybrid prehension. So there's physical prehension, which is the past, the actual world. There's the mental pole, mental prehension, I think it's called, um, which is the realm of potentialities, and this actual occasion creatively chooses between these potentialities. Is that correct? And then there's hybrid prehension, which is from I've spoken to Matt Siegel, and he says it's mental pole to mental pole.
Yeah, I find it, I think it's really important. I find it a little difficult to conceptualize, but yes, the moment is reaching out and feeling elements of the sort of the creative portion of past events.
Hmm.
So you're not just feeling sort of the brute impact of a past event, but rather certain contributions and and creative transformations that have gone on directly. And theoretically, this would be a way of a way of understanding how things like telepathy might happen.
Hmm.
He he introduced, I believe, he introduced the hybrid physical prehension because earlier on in processing reality, he had a what do you call it? Reversion, where a later stage of the concrescence would go back and change or draw on something earlier in the concrescence. And then I
Hmm.
think he realized that wasn't fitting with his way of thinking very well. So he came up with this idea of hybrid prehension as a way of introducing novelty.
Mm,
into the occasion.
mm,
I mean, I was just reading that Whitehead was up in Vermont when he was working on these process in reality, which he gave as the Gifford lectures. And I think it said he's writing a chapter a week, which is pretty astonishing that because this is a very complex book in parts, parts I don't, the measure, the more physics part and mathematics part are largely beyond me. But so he's writing them very, pretty quickly certainly by my standards. And so he didn't really like to go back he wasn't going back and rewriting when he came to new thoughts. He kind of just, put in the new approach and then said, oh, by the way, this is what I mean. And
oh wow.
so there's some parts that, seem slightly contradictory or so
Mm,
I have to be careful about which parts I'm taking as his more final thinking on the issues.
mm. Okay.
Hope I didn't get us off too far off track there.
No, you're up, you're fine. I'm thinking to myself, like, how do you even how do you even plan out and come up and problem solve through this metaphysical scheme and create the right war? I mean, where do you even start? This must have been a
Yeah,
lifelong intuition, and he just kind of spewed it out later in his life,
yeah. Well, we're now finding there's some people at I was trying to remember what university it is. What's the university that does so well in the basketball tournaments that's up in Washington? Can't remember. Anyway, there's a couple of people up there who are going through the students' notes from Whitehead's classes at Harvard, as well as doing new versions of all his writings and sort of doing a very deep dive into all the available material that they've tracked down and found in relatives' houses and one of the things they discovered in his classes, he was working out a lot of these ideas he's using his classrooms as a way of exploring these ideas that he was going to be writing in Process and Reality.
Mm.
And I've got it on the shelf. I haven't read them yet, but I think they reveal sort of how his thinking was progressing and forming and coalescing, as it were.
Mm.
But you know, I was thinking also, I think one of the big influences when he started studying at Cambridge was Maxwell's electromagnetic theories. And I don't think he never really I don't think he ever really stopped having that as a fundamental idea. His actual occasions are these sort of electromagnetic, if you make them alive and feeling,
Yeah.
his electromagnetic theory. And he's also extremely interested in geometry and measurement. He's got a whole section in Process and Reality that's difficult on measurement. And there's this book, The Quantum of Explanation by Auxier and Herstein, I think, which is a very challenging read, but they, their take is that we've misunderstood what Whitehead's interests were. Really, this is measurement and was his big thing. And he wanted us if you don't have measurement, you don't have science.
Mm.
And he felt, Einstein, for several reasons, he felt Einstein's theory of relativity didn't work metaphysically. And I think one of them was measurement became very problematic in a universe that space changes.
The ruler
How
bends.
do you do measurement,
Yeah.
But so, yeah, do you know that Whitehead has a book, his own theory of relativity?
I've heard about it, yeah, and it was a little bit different, the way he conceptualized time. But I heard that later on, the same experiments that proved Einstein's were, also went along with Whitehead's. Yeah.
They were the predictions were extremely close. We were hopeful that it would turn out that Whitehead's were better, but I think it turned out that Einstein's so far are a little closer to the experimental results.
Mm.
Can I read just when you're saying about, sorry, I've had a cold.
You're okay. Yeah, you're good.
This, you're saying, how do you organize, a lifetime of thinking into this book? And people criticize Whitehead's writing as not being good.
Mm.
And I think they're wrong. I think it's excellent. But the second paragraph at the opening of Process in Reality says, speculative philosophy is the endeavor to frame a coherent, logical, necessary system of general ideas in terms of which every element of our experience can be interpreted.
Hmm.
I think that, he puts it out there, right? And then he defines what he means by each of those terms,
Ah,
and then takes off from there. And
wow.
so he also says that because language is inadequate to ideas, and there's new ideas that you don't even have words for. To introduce new ideas, you need multiple sort of viewpoints and perspectives on it. I think I mentioned this a little bit in my book. So in Process and Reality, he goes, he does sort of a history. He looks at other, Locke and Hume and how those ideas relate to it, and then he looks at the human being and how these ideas work there, and then he does physics. So he gives you these, different views, different perspectives on what his thinking is. So I
Hmm.
think it's really quite brilliant. I mean, at first it's somewhat confusing because he's, going through all these different perspectives. But
Hmm.
this is one of the first books. I mean, it took me. I did a directed study. Just all I did was reading process, philosophy and theology,
Hmm.
and like for several months, I was like, what does he mean by an actual, And I was talking to my professor, one day, and I thought, oh, he actually means
And
there's a thing there, the human being that has these experiential, and at some point, then I thought, well, this really helps me understand how humans work, or how there's a perception, how there's theologically, how we could be interacting with an ultimate entity.
Hmm.
And so I was very excited.
Hmm.
I was very excited by that because I didn't even know what I was looking for particularly, but I was reading all different kinds of systems and finding them fascinating, but something remained unsatisfied, somehow a way to put all this together, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's I really love this idea of speculative philosophy. Its aim being trying to combine religion and science in a coherent framework.
He has a great line about the primary importance of speculative philosophy being to be the fusing of religion and science in one coherent framework.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, okay, so I kind of want to bring this back and just mention one more thing before we dive into the physics part is so societies of actual occasions, when they organize in a certain fashion, they end up creating another higher, like the many are, what is it? Increased by one? The many are
Many
some,
become one and are increased by one.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's the general, that's true of all occasions. They they feel the past events, a new event emerges, and then that new event joins, all of the other ones to be felt
Mm,
in the future. Um, the compound individual, I was trying to think if that fits into the same formula. Well, in a way it does, but the other one is the primary meaning of it, I believe.
mm.
But with an interesting question is, where do compound individuals start?
That's what I
You
was
know,
just gonna ask. Yeah,
are atoms, compound individuals of quarks?
yeah,
Are molecules compound individuals of,
yeah.
you know, cells seem to be compound individuals. There seems to be a central, the question is whether there's a center of experience that's sort of beyond just the individual elements with residing within the society.
Mm,
Is a tree a compound individual? Does a tree have a soul? You know,
mm,
and I think Whitehead would have thought not, but would have said it's an empirical question.
mm.
Maybe they do, but do stars have a central presiding series of events that experience? And I just recently gotten into plasma, And we're having a small conference on plasma and some of its implications. And have you seen Robert Temple's book, A New Science of Heaven?
No.
I'd recommend that highly. I saw him talk on the Science Medical Network, and I'd already been reading about plasma, and it's quite astonishing, really.
Hmm.
He's a fascinating guy in the first place, but his take on anyway, I'll leave you to read it. You may want to
Okay.
interview him.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe. Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. Um, okay, so if you don't mind, let's kind of start from this very bottom, which is physics and specifically the quantum realm. Can you tell me a little bit about how the importance of quantum theory in Whitehead's organic realism?
Can't tell you much, but one thing I can tell you is that quantum theory came into being, as it were, right about the time that Whitehead was creating his metaphysics. So, as did, and so when he was writing Process and Reality, he had quantum theory and Einstein's theory of relativity in mind
Hmm.
throughout it. So
Hmm.
now everything I say is my thinking. That they seem to think everything I know is wrong, so to speak. If
Okay.
I have to reread it, but yeah, so I'm gonna pretend that I didn't read their book, but um, yeah, so these these actual occasions, quantum moments would be these actual occasions, and that Epperson book I mentioned, um, describes what Whitehead's idea is that each new moment draws upon the sort of a vast reservoir of potential. And the way we think of, I think they think of quantum moments is that it's synthesizing a probability field that would be
Hmm.
their way of, I think, describing it. But this
Hmm.
probability field would be interpreted in Whitehedian terms more as a field of potential things to be incorporated.
Hmm.
And but these moments would just be the most fundamental actual occasions. Obviously very very short duration,
Hmm.
and I guess it's important to mention that the actual occasions don't happen in time, but they themselves generate space time, as it were, space time events,
Hmm.
and the entire the universe is this Indra, you might call it Indra's net of these ongoing interacting feeling occasions that creates the texture of space-time.
Hmm.
But I'm afraid I'm not a physicist, so I can't give you some. I can recommend books that seem good to me,
Great.
but
Yeah.
I'm leery of trying to go into any depth on things I'm not really.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Yeah. Me neither. Obviously, I mean, I'm not too well versed in physics or the quantum realm, but yeah, it's interesting that he kind of, yeah, just as you were saying, the whole quantum study of the quantum realm was arising during his time, and he, incorporated it into his scheme. Um, so that's really interesting. Yeah, just like how you're saying, new quantum particles arise out of primitive decisions about how to actualize the probability field constituted by the influence of the past events. I'm reading, by the way, off of your that's a piece of your writing there. So yeah, I
Uh,
find that very interesting. Maybe that kind of reminds me of how your question earlier, you said, what if it's all physical prehension, what was the first physical prehension? It was all mental, it was all probability, And I find that in my head at least it fits in nicely with the probability distribution of the quantum realm, and then it collapses the wave function into a particle, and then maybe that's the first physical prehension, and then it just kind of continues on. I don't, obviously all speculation, not actual physicists.
I've always been, I'm bothered by the idea that it's our consciousness that makes things collapse.
Mm.
somehow that reality wouldn't happen without our observing it. As you know, I'm sure, Schrodinger's, cat thing was supposed to be sarcastic, as was the Big Bang, by the way, that, somebody was making fun of the idea of the Big Bang,
Mm,
when he named it the Big Bang.
yeah.
And, um, that's one of the other things I've been interested in recently that, I have a book that by Eric Lerner, The Big Bang Never Happened. And
Mm.
you calling into question the very limited evidence of the Big Bang in the first place, and which anyway, there's cosmology is still up in the air.
Oh yeah, especially with the dark matter stuff. I mean, Sheldrake really goes after that in his books.
That's one of the things I think plasma
Yeah.
theory might, 90 over 99% of the universe is plasma, and
Yeah.
yet we base a lot of our science on
On
what's hard solid matter here, and
yeah.
so we're kind of missing a lot there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, the next step, you know, um, zooming the microscope out, so to speak, is biochemistry. And you mentioned the book that Whitehead's cosmology, his metaphysical scheme is essentially just a combination of quantum theory and cell theory.
With all that they're discovering about how complex cells are and the interactions going on within them, the idea that there might be some kind of central event that's coordinating the millions of I mean, not you have to go quantum, just all the molecular events going on, within a cellular complex is
Hmm.
astounding. And the what's I mean, I just I haven't taken chemistry since and biology since high school, but it's the idea that one can think through the biochemistry level by using the same basic tools that the atoms are these are these momentary occasions interacting for forming more complex molecules that are also being informed by the back and forth flow, and then the cell is in communication with the molecular structure, which is also influencing the overall cellular activities, and then on up into the human level. um, I just it seems to me that this approach, gives us so much more of a holistic way of thinking through. I mean, not just the mind, I mean, the ultimate is the mind body problem, but but who was the who was the is it Waddington, C.H. Waddington, who I think got the Nobel Prize
Epigenetics.
for some of his cellular things. It's very Whitehedian,
Yeah.
and use the idea. So I think it's even if you don't adapt the metaphysics per se, to swallow it whole. A lot of the ideas and clues within it have been very helpful. I think David Bohm drew a lot on Whitehead.
Hmm.
Henry Stapp, a lot of the physicists have drawn on Whitehead's overall scheme.
Hmm. Hmm. And Bohm, I think, has worked with Sheldrake trying to show, morphic resonance and all this kind of stuff. Okay. So, yeah, go ahead.
I, I've always struggled with his what was Bohm's the implicate order and the explicate order.
Hmm.
I think you can sort of say that that's the internal processes of these occasions of experience. But for some reason or other, when I'm reading it, I always feel like I can't quite put my finger on what he's talking about.
Yeah.
That's probably a limitation in me and not in his theory. But it's another example of where I found Whitehead easier to get my mind around and use.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. There's this we mentioned that higher order occasions of experiences emerge from a bunch of societies. It's the compound individual. And is that essentially Whitehead's attempt to solve the combination problem of panpsychism? I don't know if he was even aware that there was a combination problem, but if for the listeners not aware, combination problem of panpsychism is that, if there are experiences or whatever it is, consciousness that's all around within particles, within my organs, then how come right now in this moment it doesn't feel like I'm the summation of all these different consciousnesses? It seems like I'm just one continuous thing. So it's a problem people like Philip Goff, contemporary panpsychists struggle with or try to overcome. But yeah, back to Whitehead. Is this a way to overcome that problem?
Well, I don't want to. I want to be clear that yes, Charles Hartshorne was the one who had the compound individual,
Mm.
thinking that's what was implied within Whitehead's
Oh,
system.
okay. Mm.
But yeah, and that's what one of the big things William James dealt with in that final book I was telling you about, A Pluralistic Universe. He has a chapter called "The Compounding of Consciousness,"
Mm.
where he's looking at that question of how does these things how could consciousness combine and become, and he actually says the Whitehedian solution, but then somehow seems to have loses it, and then goes on that he says he's going to give up the logic because he thinks that happens, and he's whether if it's impossible logically, he's just going to give up the logic because William James is kind of funny, like saying things like that. But I believe Whitehead's solution once again is to look at it not vertically but horizontally. So my neurons are having their moments of sentience.
Mm.
And then immediately after that, my psyche event that flows into it and it's unified. So it's not, I'm not having it's not happening simultaneously. So I'm not have to feel them at the same time I'm having my experience. I'm
Mm.
synthesizing these moments into a new thing. So that's where the unity, the unifying factor comes from. And then that experience is flowing back into the world and into the neurons, telling them to, lift my hand and
Mm.
talk to you. I think that's rather a brilliant solution to the compounding, or what did you call it?
The combination problem?
It's a combination problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, you sort of need Whitehead's framework that there are these, different levels of events going on
Yeah.
for that to work.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Fechner's work. I interviewed Dr. Robert Pepperell, who wrote this book, said does matter feel or mind matters, something like that. Um, and he talks about Fechner's work and tries to expand upon it. And he himself, when I asked him, what does it mean to see something from the inside or the outside? He said himself he kind of struggles with that. So I think it's a fascinating framework, but that is a big problem of it. What does it mean to be inside and outside? But Whitehead, reading through your book, I realized that, well, yeah, it doesn't have that problem at all because it's kind of like there's my psyche now, there's my subjective experience, this actual occasion, and it's kind of like hovering ahead, I guess, or over above. The way I like to think of it is it's like above it, and then it's taking from the actual occasions of the neurons in my brain, but also all of the previous actual
Yeah.
occasions of the psyche itself.
Yeah.
So
The way David Griffin would illustrate this on the blackboard would be he'd have sort of two lines, and then below there'd be like all these little dots, and then the arrow up to the single dot that's the psyche, and then the
hmm,
psyche is an arrow going up, and then indicating a slight temporal you know difference,
hmm.
and then it's going back in. So I wanted to have that in my book too, but
Yeah,
I didn't. I did.
illustrations.
I should have done that. But whereas, by the time I was working with a publisher, so you try to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yes, I mean, I really think I wrote down somewhere, if I can find it, that William James thing, which let's see.
Hmm.
What he says is in pluralistic universe, he says, the whole, which is my experience, would then be its unifying reaction upon the whole, which I think he's talking about God here, trying to
Hmm.
figure out a way that God could be in the world. The whole, which is its experience, would then be its unifying reaction on our experience, and not those very experiences self-combined. Um, we're saying, what we're talking about right now. But Charles Hartshorne, I think, is the one who talks about this an asymmetrical relationship. Yes, which is by which he means what we're talking about. They're not. It's not happening at the same time. It's an as
Hmm.
there's a why they're called process. There's a process. There's a flow of things happening, and
Yeah. Yeah.
they're not
Yeah.
simultaneous. And um, made me think of something else, but it's eluding me. Oh, I just want to show one other wonderful Hartshorne quote. He's got these two. He wrote until he was like 100 years old, and
Mm.
two. He's a very detailed and logical thinker, but two of his last books are quite wonderful. I think one is called Creativity in American Philosophy, and the one I particularly called Insights and Oversights of Great Thinkers,
Mm.
because he knew a lot of he knew a lot of the thinkers of the 20th century. And anyway, this quote is from somewhere in there, if I can find it. It's describing the Whitehead's metaphysical idea of the prehension, how important that is.
Mm.
Uh, oh, he said Hartshorne said regarding his the metaphysical idea of prehension. He says regarding Whitehead's novel metaphysical. Oh, sorry. He says causality, substance, memory, perception, temporal succession, modality are all but modulations of one principle of creative synthetic experiencing, feeding entirely on its own products. So basically that idea of the new occasion, feeling the past and
Mm.
creating something new out of it. This I regard as the most powerful metaphysical generalization ever accomplished.
Wow.
And so, you think of causality as, these past moments, are influencing the new moment. Substance, that's things are made up of actual occasions. Memory is occurring by feeling
Mm.
past events. Although I sort of think that memory is somehow or other embedded a little bit in neural activity, but perception. Anyway, it's temporal succession. And it's quite astonishing, really.
Mm. And this kind of overcomes this controversy of top-down causation that scientific materialism seems to really struggle with explaining.
Seems to me like it offers a very straightforward way of understanding it. But you have to accept the hypothesis that there's sort of things that aren't matter in the old way of thinking about it.
Mm. Mm.
Well, I can't see these psychic events, so they put them under the microscope. But I mean, when you really get down to it, what are you seeing when I mean, what is it that we're perceiving? And I mean, well, I think I'm going to get lost if I go into this into perception and too far.
You're okay. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about perception later on too. I have a whole bunch of questions, but feel free to just like flow, go down whatever rabbit hole you'd like to. Yeah.
other rabbit hole I was thinking, I read this book by a Norwegian philosopher. I think it's called Metaphysical Experiments, where he's arguing that as we've gotten more and more complex instruments, in physics in particular, like the giant collider in Switzerland, and more computer programs set up to analyze the data, we end up at a certain point having as self-fulfilling prophecies, because the only thing it's aimed at, the only data it's looking for is the data to confirm the hypothesis.
Yeah.
And he's feeling that we've reached a point in particular in physics that the instruments are no longer revealing evidence; they're creating the
Mm,
evidence.
mm.
Um, but there was some direction I was going to go with how we never really see. Anyway, ask me a different question.
Okay. Yeah. Um, Definitely. Yeah. Sheldrake talks also about the Higgs boson being this thing where people were direly wanted to find, and it's just like this kind of like confirmation bias. Again, don't know much about the physics, but he talks about that in his book. Um, so it seems like there is one, I am a actual occasion, but what can we say about different structures of the brain that, let's say different personalities? A psychoanalytic theory would say I am not just one person. There's also an emotional me. There's the superego, the id, what have you. But even from a neuroscience perspective, the brain kind of has these layers. There's the reptilian brain stem. Uh, Certain things are controlled or associated with that part. The limbic brain, the mammalian brain, and the neocortex. And, I have an impulse to be angry or to be hungry or whatever it is. It's almost like a different personalities coming up. So how do we deal with this idea of different personalities and fitting that into the actual occasion?
That's a good question. At some point in my thinking, I was trying to sort out whether it made sense of multiple personalities having distinct histories of different flows of actual occasions, and I didn't really come to any. That didn't seem to work out terribly well trying to do it that way, and I do think that Whitehead's idea of perception was that what's his key term there? Transmutation, where we take millions of tiny pieces of information and unify it into into red, the color red, a red book. But normally that's described that you're seeing all the molecular elements are vibrating redly, and that gets comes through the nervous system.
Hmm.
But it seems to me that with all the things we've discovered about in the brain and neurology since Whitehead's time, the stacked cells that do various processing to create shapes, and that we probably want to see the brain as doing a lot more activity for it's this like very sort of a rich neural matrix that's being absorbed by the new moment of experience, which takes a little pressure off. If this moment of experience had to unify the entire past every moment, that's a lot of work.
Hmm.
And so I think we can assume that the brain is doing a lot of the perceptual sorting out, as it were. So I'm not quite sure how that bears on the more psychological, issues. Um, I would think, I talk about the unconscious somewhat in the book, and that Whitehead offers an interesting idea that the past is the ultimate depth unconscious. But there's different things feeding into it. There's my own past experiences that are feeding into it. There's the neural feelings and energies that are flowing in. Um, I guess I would picture that there's, an ongoing structure, an ongoing patterns that get repeated automatically, basically, that
Mm,
psychedelics disrupt, along with neurofunctioning that disrupt these patterns and
mm,
create new possibilities for experience. But that these, ongoing patterns would be what's playing a big role in what's sorting out, how we feel, how, our different habitual ways of handling the impulses. What does it William James say that I think he thought that emotions arise out of the body. If I feel happy, it's because something's happened in my in my body. Or if I feel sad, first I cry, then I feel sad.
mm.
Which is I'm not sure how that fits in, but obviously the bodily states are impacting the psyche in more significant ways than I think we often think. Think I'm sad, so I cry, versus I cry, so I'm sad.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And this is something I kind of wanted to delve into further is how psychoanalytic theory seems to uh, neglect, I want to say, or not mention or talk about the importance of the body on the psyche. And you mentioned that in the book too, and how Whitehead's model overcomes that, or in some way, it helps us better understand how the body can impact the psyche. Can you speak to that a little?
Well, I mean, the psyche obviously is deeply embedded as a compound individual, and in this intense flow of feeling back and forth.
Mm,
Uh, and Grof emphasizes that also, that one part of the holotropic breath work is deep body work. And I mean, specifically says that psychoanalysis largely has neglected the body, and that in trauma. I mean, I think it's now more wealth, more generally recognized that trauma gets caught in the body, and that if you can breathe deeply, you can release some of that trauma. Or they do intense body work in the holotropic, and
mm,
just pushing. The first time I did a holotropic breathwork session, I felt like there was something in my back, and I had
mm.
Stan pushing his elbow,
Oh my.
really hard into my back. And he's a big guy. And I
Yeah,
just wanted more and more. And it felt like I was a butterfly, being pinned, onto a specimen tray.
yeah,
And I'm not sure what that was freeing up, but it's often people have very big breakthroughs with this kind of intense body work.
yes,
Of course, there are exceptions. Wilhelm Reich, out of whose work a lot of the Rolfing and bioenergetics and Alexander Lowen's work. A lot of that comes out of Reich's emphasis that on the body, the character armor, the repression is the body. And
mm, mm.
do you know Wilhelm Reich?
I don't know, but I will
Oh,
definitely check them out. Yeah.
he was one of Freud's major disciples, along with Jung and Otto Rank, and was in Germany, and was became a very big advocate of sort of free sex for teenagers. And we need to have open sex. That's where everyone's getting repressed. And the Nazis didn't love this, and so he ended up coming to America, and actually a very strange thing of being. He developed an orgone energy box. He thought that there's this energy that can be accumulated, with particular shielding and setup, and that this could help with disease and even cancer. And he ended up with the federal government coming after him, burning his books and locking him away in prison, where he died, for false advertising about, sending, for treatment of disease. And is all very, very odd, But
Really?
he was I mean, he's extremely brilliant thinker. And there's somewhere in one of his books where he and another man would spend long hours at night debating whether Beethoven or Bach was the greater composer.
Hmm.
I thought I would love to have been privy to, those kinds of conversations.
What do you think, Beethoven or Bach?
Yeah, I don't know how I love them both so much. Yeah. I mean, Beethoven's got that, energy and emotion, and Bach's got such incredibly intricate, so, so one's more mental and one's more physical, as it were.
Yeah.
What do
Nice.
you prefer? I'm
Honestly,
thinking you're a Beethoven
I'm
guy.
not a big classical music head. I do want to get into it. I think eventually I will. I'm more it's like hip hop right now. I kind of go through phases,
Right.
it's a
Yeah.
process. I'm
Yeah.
concressing hip hop at the moment, so yeah. Um
Well,
that's
Beethoven would be doing hip hop if he were around.
yeah, it's Bates the explanation between Beethoven and Bach sounds like the primordial and the consequent nature of God, a little bit.
Yeah.
There you go. That's a really interesting story, William Reich. I'll look that up and yeah, I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole for sure. So how come I can't see? This is a thing with Fechner again, is you can't see other minds because you're only seeing them from the outside. So how come I can't see your occasion of experience? You at your very essence. Is it because I'm not looking, I'm seeing your body, so I'm kind of seeing the past. I'm seeing my body, it's the past. But is your occasion of experience occurring at the same time as mine, and that's why I can't see you because there's no time passing? Yeah. How does that work?
Well, we don't, our events are individual, actually, our psyche is a series of individual actual occasions. And we never directly perceive an individual actual occasion. We're seeing, societies and collections, or actually most things are aggregates, is, the term that David Griffin liked to use. A car is, an aggregate of, atoms and molecules. It doesn't have, unless it's, I don't know if you remember the TV show My Mother the Car, which had a had a soul, could talk and stuff.
Hmm.
But somehow this guy's mother was incarnated as this car. You
Hmm.
can imagine that show didn't last very long. But
Oh,
aggregates, don't, the molecules are sentient, but the car, the cars. But what we perceive are, our collections, and large collections of actual occasions and societies of occasions. So so we never directly perceive, even if we're looking at a cell, that's what I was trying to get before, at a microscope, we're not seeing the experiential center of the cell. We're seeing the collection of pieces that make up the cell.
hmm.
Um, I mean, I think that's just how our perception generally works. I suppose people may be in very non-ordinary states, occasionally see this aura.
Hmm.
And one of the questions is, how large are these? Is an actual occasion? And I was thinking quite at some length on this, and there's various people who try to work it out, because Whitehead just refers to what is he? How does he? What's the term he uses? Sort of these tiny flashes within the interstices of the brain. He float, going around. But I don't think you really would want to think of it quite that way, because I think you would want the event being more or less overlapping all of, the whole, at least the whole brain. So it could be, feeding on, so like a field, feeding on all parts, or maybe extending, through the entire physical organism. And at times, as people see these larger auras, maybe it's even larger. And
Hmm.
so maybe people do see, maybe this is as close as you can get to seeing the human actual occasion is the bodily aura.
Yeah. It seems especially difficult looking microscopically into the cells, like you mentioned, and even upwards. If Earth Gaia has this larger actual occasion, we can't see it, and I guess that would also apply to the cells looking upward. The cell probably doesn't know it's part of, me,
Feels something, but yes, probably doesn't know much.
It probably
Have
isn't
you
much,
ever
yeah.
read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy?
No.
It's quite fantastic. The first one's called Out of the Silent Planet, but the second one's called Paralandra. And it ends up with this, it's kind of a fable of good and evil. But it's also, I wrote a little paper about it because it's extremely, it's an incredible example of Grof's perinatal stages.
Hmm.
The imagery that works through the book. But at the end of it, the hero climbs up this mountain on, he's in Venus, and it's like, an early stage where Venus is entering some new phase. And he climbs up to the top of the mountain, and various spirits of different planets show up as sort of as angelic presences. And there's experimenting with what shape to take for him to be able to interact with them. And I guess there's a description in the Bible of wheels within wheels or something. But one of them turns out it's this gigantic thing with all these things interacting, and it completely, freaks them out because it's
Hmm.
so overwhelming. So that
Hmm.
I think, end up taking on more human-esque forms. But yeah, I mean that's sort of an illustration of what would it be like to meet, and the description of angels, and are can vary from very sort of gentle to very very fierce, as I'm sure you're aware of.
Hmm.
And that of course opens the whole door of what kind of transpersonal and spiritual entities are there, and are they real, and then what does it real mean in that case?
Hmm.
I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, this is bringing me to my next question is like, um, how do you know psychedelic experiences are real? And people, sometimes ask me this, and I say, sometime, first of all, obviously there's this noetic quality. I think that's how William James described it, is like it feels very real. It feels realer than reality. So whatever our feeling of realness is now, it's like dialed up 1,000 notches or whatever. And I also uncover information that's important about my life. I can like relive or re-see memories that I've long forgotten in my childhood that I know are true. It's like I'm re-remembering. And sometimes, as you mentioned, the perinatal stage, Grof's work, people remember their births, or the experience of, whatever it was that happened during that time. And that kind of memory doesn't just stop there, it goes all the way back to, the so-called Big Bang. So where's that line? Is that a lie? And then this is just absolute truth? No, it seems like if you follow that to its conclusion, no, it's all what you're seeing is an actual memory of what is happening. And yeah, tell me a little bit about how memory works in actual occasions. It doesn't seem that we need a brain. It seems like memory is just this prehensile activity, and the brain just kind of heightens it.
Well, assuming we could, David Griffin has a really interesting book called Philosophy, Psychology, and Spirituality, where he looks at various instances of whether or not we can survive without a body, basically. And so he looks, at ghost phenomena, mediumship, reincarnation, um, and so so one of the questions is, if we did survive death, what would we do? Could would we have any experience whatsoever? And he argues that yes, we would. We'd have memory, certainly,
Hmm.
and so I think there could be a kind of the memory that is just the direct flow of the past into the present. And that's what's emphasized with Whitehead often. But as I said in the book, as with perception, I think we need to factor that some things are actually stored in some way within the neural network. I think like maybe when you learn the ABCs, it gets sort of jammed in there in a way that so you don't have to access, your second grade class every time you want to remember a letter. It's somehow more of it. I think it can be these different kinds of memory. And I think
Mm.
that, so I think there might be a neuro memory along with, this more ego
Mm.
memory, and maybe, and then, sort of a transpersonal memory of the kind you've just been talking about.
Mm. That's very interesting. Yeah, I think that sounds like it's more correct to think of it that way. It's not just this transpersonal memory. Yeah.
The question, I mean, certainly the experiences you have, if you have an experience, it's real, but whether or not it corresponds with something, externally actual, it is sort of is the more complicated question. When we were in one of my training groups, we had a man who was experiencing an alien, an extraterrestrial person would come and visit him,
Mm.
and he's having these experiences. And this guy was like a body worker, very solid older guy, and he's having these experiences. And so at some point, I was, asking, whether or not they were real or sort of actual. And it's going back and forth with people. And Stan said, well, what would the difference be? And do you know Rick Doblin?
Yes. Creator of
Yeah,
maps, director of
yeah,
maps.
he was at college with me, and then he was in my holotropic breathwork
Oh,
training
wow.
group.
Wow.
So I know him pretty well. He's a very sharp guy. So,
Mm.
we were going back and forth, and he said, well, let's say you got in a spaceship. The guy told you what planet he's from. You take the spaceship to the planet and ask them if this guy is really from there, and they say yes. Now that would be sort of confirmation that it's actual, versus being more
Mm.
real and semi-imaginary experience.
Mm.
But sort of, you don't get to do that very often, to so when people, like ayahuasca, they have, a lot of entities, experiences, and you're definitely right that often these experiences have a feeling of importance to them, and I mean that's sort of hard to describe, but
Mm.
yes, it's such a deep feeling that there's something of significance and power there that it's hard to just ascribe it to enhanced imagination.
Mm. Definitely.
I
Um,
haven't taken ayahuasca, but I've had other things.
yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, in my day we didn't have ayahuasca like you kids.
You Gen Zs
Emma
and
gained
your
all this
iOS.
crazy stuff, DMT3 and
Yeah, DMT3. That's funny. Yeah, the 5-MeO DMT and this frog toad venom, it's gotten it's gotten really out of hand.
I was playing golf with a friend and his nephew was with us. And he was talking about the various stuff he'd been taking. And I was like, holy cow. And I think he named like 20 substances I'd never heard of. It's
It's
it's pretty wild.
it is wild, yeah, yeah.
Alexander Shugin. Does that ring a bell?
No.
He was a chemist and a researcher for, some kind of large pharmaceutical company, I believe. And he's out in California, and he started doing sort of his own research on various psychedelic substances. And I think he sort of invented and then described the phenomenology of dozens, if not hundreds, of psychedelic substances. And he's got two books, I think TCAL and PCAL, and it's like, I can't think of the right, like phenopharmacy is some chemical name. I've known and loved. So, the IKAL is the, I've known and loved, and the P is the particular area of chemicals. And then TCAL is the same, except that it's, some kind of chemical family that begins with a T. And fascinating guy. That's that and he had this whole home lab, where he did
Mm.
did all this work, and
Mm.
I'm not sure how it was legal, but I guess it was more or less.
Yeah, if you make them, if you synthesize, new ones in the lab, then
Oh yeah, yeah. They haven't
yeah.
had time to outlaw them yet.
Yeah. His name is Alexander Shugon, you said?
Yes, I think it's SHU. I think it might just be SHUGAN,
SH.
but I think that's close enough if you Google it.
Okay. 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 Yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
It's a huge book. I have not read it through. It would
Okay.
be I think more of a reference book if you were
Yeah.
exploring those realms.
Yeah, for sure. Um, can you tell me about how you say in the book you say by grounding Jungian psychology and Whitehedian metaphysics, the psyche's depth dimensions, individual and collective, can be understood as its past. We've talked a lot about it, but like really trying to understand this idea of the unconscious, again, not being vertical, being horizontal, but how does that work with things like archetypes, and so on and so forth? Are archetypes things that past memories of past humans, past psyches that have lived and set the standard, so to speak, and I can kind of tap into that, like, yeah.
I've always found archetypes to be somewhat confusing. I mean, I think in a practical way, it's interesting to encounter the symbol of the wise old man, or various symbols of the hermit, and I think that's probably very useful in therapy to have those things come up in dreams, and work with them, or have them as important symbols.
Hmm.
But exactly how to place them in kind of a metaphysical system, or a psychological theoretical system, I've always found somewhat problematic. Because if they were just accumulated past experience, I mean, would we really have all that? A lot of the symbols that are mentioned don't seem like they would have grown out of accumulated experience. I mean, from Whitehedian, you could say they're part of the primordial, the eternal objects.
Hmm.
Why are those particular ones sorted out? And so I don't know if that's going to be a useful way of thinking through things theoretically. I think quite a bit of Jung's work, is very valuable, in sessions, and
Hmm.
in working with people. But I'm not sure that it's. I mean, obviously he's a super brilliant. I've got his collected works here. It's
Hmm.
incredibly brilliant guy. So probably I feel a little guilty about throwing things out about it in that way about his system. But
Hmm.
um, I think he, like Piaget, if I'm not mistaken, were somewhat unfortunately over influenced by Kantian ideas. And so and I think that made them a little skewed their thinking a little, because Kant was the big guy. And once again, 50 times as smart as I am. So, I don't like when people say, oh yeah, Plato, he made this mistake, dismissing these people who are unbelievable geniuses. But I think there's a, the whole collective unconscious I suppose that's a little easier to think through, that, if we have a access to the past, with excuse me, throwing in Sheldrake's ideas of morphic fields, you would have certain kinds of ideas and patterns that are reinforced and become much more accessible, because 200 million people have all experienced that thing. And so I think from the Whiteheadian, and Sheldrakean point of view, the past as these as a general flow of all things, but as in our everyday experience, there's certain things that are very little comes through, but certain things are highlighted because of how we are. One of which is our perception. We're designed that way, so if a lion walks in the room, we pay attention to that rather than to the symbol of the hermit, that somebody experienced 500 years ago.
Mm.
That tends to dominate. But I think there, would be other patterns that would be strong and certainly would resonate at the lower levels of our experience and sort of help form the general structure of each moment. If that's at all helpful, I don't know.
Mm. Mm.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking something else about the general idea of the collective unconscious. Maybe it'll come to me in a moment.
And this question came up right before the interview. How does this connect to dreams? Like, what is there a Whitehedian explanation of going to sleep, dreams? What happens to the actual occasion when we're asleep? It seems like there's not a whole lot of experience happening there. Uh, and yeah, how does that bridge into, Freud, the unconscious and dreams, it being the gateway with sleep? So have you ever thought about that or read up anything about that?
I haven't written anything. Whitehead, as far as I know, doesn't talk a lot about dreaming, except that that's part of the part of the general experience that needs to be taken into account when uh, when thinking about what makes up reality. I would think you'd basically have the same general idea that 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 you'd have with psychology, um, most psychological theories, where when you shut off, the perception, the external perception, and tone or at least dampen that way down. Um, just as I was saying, that normally dominates our experience, but if you dampen it way down, it frees up more subtle feelings and images from the depths of our own experience, and theoretically, more generally can flow in. So, people occasionally have, kind of psychic experiences. So I think we've been much more open to that. But, I think excuse me, I think Freud, was his idea of the day residue is quite relevant. We take memories and images that weren't fully digested and kind of play around with them, but we play around with them in ways that I think sometimes they're just playful, and other times, things that are unresolved we're working on. But I don't think you have to go very far afield to picture that. We still have these events flowing on. They're just drawing more on the past and the world at large than they are drawing on well, they're not drawing on perception, but I suppose they're drawing a lot more on subtle bodily feelings too. So emotions that might have been not
Mm.
noticed or repressed might be more likely to flow in, thus giving us a sort of a window to our emotional world.
Mm. Mm. Okay.
I took first class I took at college was with Anne Faraday, who written a very popular book called Dream Power,
Mm.
and I believe her husband was John Wren Lewis, who was this guy who'd apparently had some experience where the back of his head opened up, and he became, I don't know, enlightened immediately, and so they were an interesting couple to take this class from, and
Mm.
um, her book was kind of a synthesis of just a bunch of different ways of talking about dreams. But I was very interested. I took a couple classes with a Jungian therapist down at the college too, and
Mm.
yeah, I was fascinated with all that um, in those days.
Not at all related to Michael Faraday?
Um, well, I don't know one way or the other. I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
thinking not. I'm thinking probably not, though.
probably not. Yeah, yeah. It's just don't really hear that last name, so I just
I
shot in the
could look
dark.
that up.
Yeah, I'll look it up. Yeah. Um. Okay. So, how does death play into all this? Kind of want to enter now into the transpersonal realm. We've talked a lot about what we actually experience, and um, psychedelics will be a very important tool of understanding this a lot more. But yeah, what is death?
Stan Grof loves the idea of ego death as being sort of the opener to the transpersonal realm, and so that but that's obviously a psychological thing. Although I have to say that in my psychedelic experiences, when it felt like I might be dying, I was not. It did not feel like a psychological thing. It felt like high panic. And unfortunately, in those days, I wasn't really on top of how to handle this and deal with it, despite having read Leary and Alpert's and Metzner's books on the psychedelic experience based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So I should have been more, but without it's a wonderful thing to have a guide, have a guide with you on these experiences, so they can say, just relax and let go. It's going to be okay. You are still breathing. And,
Hmm.
I think that would have helped me go a lot further into some of these things. But okay, so there's the ego death and real death. I I don't know. It's as I do recommend that book on by David Griffin, the philosophy, psychology, and spirituality, because I'd say more than anything I've read, that gave me a sense that there's some very interesting evidence supporting the idea of existence after death. And I found that, that's kind of hopeful. Although at times, I can understand why people would want to get off the wheel of, of rebirth and, and relax in the light or whatever that's about. But I, I Charles Hartshorne, I thought that, take from a Whitehedian perspective, we could look at subjective, but immortality. Whitehead talks about objective immortality, but there he's just talking about how things tend to continue onwards, and also God's preservation of all that's happened, continual absorption. And so then the question was, is there subjective immortality? I think is the one we're, concerned about when we're thinking about our own death. And, some Whitehedians think that, there would be, and there's certainly, within Whitehead's system, as we were talking about, you can picture that this actual occasion, that's the human psyche, that chain, although it's deeply embedded in the body, theoretically could continue on and feed on memory and parapsychological perception and have experiences, and who knows, maybe reincarnate. So I think it's a possibility that can be envisioned in a way that it's hard to envision with a materialistic point of view. You're the body's gone, you're gone.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting possibility. But there were, I think Charles Hartshorne, some people felt that, we've had our life, we've made it, we've done our thing, and, we've contributed to the world and to God, and, that's enough. It's more of a personal philosophical, I think, preference. And some other people are quite are more prone to think that, if the universe makes it possible, it should happen because of, all the unfairness, somebody born in a horrible life, and why would God do that to people? But That's more of the traditional religious way of looking at it. I think I've never met anybody who knew the answer to that. You know, as I've never known anyone that's, fully, people have very powerful experiences, but nothing seems to convince totally
Mm.
about any sort of ultimate questions.
Eckhart Tolle seems really convinced. He
Yeah,
goes,
that wise ass. I just, I just tease it. I think I might mention in my book that I went to see him talk in New York, and my girlfriend, loved to sit up front. So it was this big room, but we were up front. And he came out, and he's, this kind of frail guy, and kind of went out and he started talking, and my eyes started vibrating. That thing that can
mm,
happen with psychedelics where your eyes start. I was like,
mm,
holy cow,
mm.
this guy is actually doing something, predicting some kind of field that
Wow.
I don't think it's ever happened to me with any, in a normal state before. So,
Wow.
something is definitely, I loved his first book, and he's, something's going on with him. And um, I don't know what do you say if you said, have you met God? Are you sure there's God? Would you say yes? I definitely there is. We converse daily, or what do you think would happen?
Yeah, you're asking like what he says about death?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he goes. I'm also obviously, yeah, I'm very well versed with his book. The Power of Now really has had a big impact in my life. He says death is an illusion. It's like taking off clothes. You never really lose who you really are. So he says, yeah, death is just like a realization of who you really are, and who you were all along. So I don't know. For me, I could imagine how maybe we embed ourselves in. We'll get to God's primordial nature, but maybe we end up as a potential, or this actual occasion uh will stay or maintain, or I don't know. But that's his answer. It's essentially like akin to taking off clothes. You never really wore your clothes anyway. You just assumed this is who you are. It's an error in identification.
I like all that imagery. I just wonder how he knows that that's what will happen.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if if I think it might be somewhat of a myth that Buddha re-experienced all his reincarnations, just before enlightenment. But people have very convincing reincarnation experiences, and I guess if I had them, I would think, yes, I know that I have survived death before, and I will. So I can see people could be
Hmm.
convinced of that through
Hmm.
various things that have happened to them, and I just think you can't be absolutely sure.
Have you not gained insight through your personal psychedelic trips? Like you mentioned blue acid, sine waves, the big one.
Yeah, I would say that they've they they've broadened my sense of what's possible, and that there might are other well that there might be a God actually, and that their astral realms might be there, and that things are much reality is much deeper and broader than I imagined. But it hasn't given me, well, I haven't gone far enough to say that I'm sure about with death or reincarnation. Or
Hmm.
these, I did a workshop with, if I can remember his name, it's not coming to me, at Esalen. It was a 5-day workshop on past lives. This guy had written a book about, and he had a very simple sort of guided imagery thing to take you into a kind of an altered state, and to open up to past lives. And, it felt to me like I was, somewhat creating it, somewhat imagining, but it was really quite vivid and emotional. And, I couldn't say, these are definitely past lives, but it was a surprisingly powerful experience with a, very simple, just, opening up technique. So I mean, I guess maybe I'm kind of that little bit of a scientist in me still around that, well, yeah, I mean, it was powerful, but I'm not absolutely convinced. Kind of.
Yeah. Do you personally believe in God? And if so, how does he operate in our reality?
Let me take the second half of the Whitehedian approach, which I like a lot. That although it's a little tricky because in Process and Reality, Whitehead sort of presents a couple different ways of viewing God, and one that some people take very seriously is that God is just one everlasting actual occasion, as it were. It is just an ongoing concrescence that absorbs everything, and Whitehead does, indicate that at times. I tend to think that he was just thinking through these ideas initially and hadn't fully thought through all the implications. Because when his student Charles Hartshorne said, if that was true, God's not going to be able to interact with influence the entities because the way things influence each other is by the occasion and by having a series of occasions. That's an interaction. And so he said, "Oh yeah, I guess that's right," or something, you know. Um, so that's the modification that I like that Charles Hartshorne and David Griffin, which is that God, like us, is these series of moments of experience, obviously enormously, more complex and in depth. But because of that, when we're feeling the past to create, when a new moment of experience, my new moment of experience is happening, I'm feeling the entire past, and one of the things I'm feeling is God's last moment of, last set of feelings. And so I take that and in Whitehead's scheme, that gives me a direction, an ideal direction, an initial aim on what would be the best way what would be the best way for this moment to go. And so, when you have that moment, like it feels like everything's going just as it should, or I think that's tuning into that. So you're feeling, not only God's presence, but so mystical experience becomes quite easy to conceive of this way. You're actually in the depths of your being, God is entering in, God's experience is flowing in. So if that can raise up somehow, through psychedelics or meditation,
Mm.
then, that can become more of a direct conscious awareness rather than just in-depth feeling. And then after my moment, after I've had my moment of experience, God's next moments are absorbing that. And so God is, as Whitehead calls the fellow sufferer, the great companion, because, God feels, what we feel. And hopefully is big enough to take it. We assume God is. Anyway, so that's how I envision. I think it's a wonderful way of envisioning that God is with us, not some kind of either abstract thing or a completely aloof entity, or controlling everything, because we're in this interaction. We have our own creativity and our own free will, as it were. So I think that really helps with a lot of different problematic issues, in theology. The problem of evil. God doesn't make everything happen. God isn't in control of everything. God's influencing everything, but all occasions have their own self-determination also. Um, as I think I've tried to escape of my I guess that's I the experience I had was of this just enormous energy, power, actually presence, I should say. It felt like a presence I was approaching. That was completely overwhelming. So that made me think, well, and it was this powerful light that I was coming towards, and that felt as close to an image of what, at least my ability to create an image of what God might be like, and I was surprised. When I've heard the term, I have a personal God, I was like, well, what does that mean? It's my own God, Does that mean that's my, by personal, I would think that should mean that God is a person, as it were, an ongoing conscious entity interacting and on with the world. And so that's as far as I've gotten. I haven't been doing psychedelics for many years because I tend to like these things. Anything I take that changes me, I love too
Mm,
much.
mm.
So as I mentioned in my book, I finally had to get sober and cut it all out, which is unfortunate because as soon as I got sober, I got sort of unlimited access to wonderful, wonderful drugs and people to work with. So God obviously has a sense of humor,
Yeah. Yeah.
or irony at least.
Irony, yeah. How does process theology talk about Christ's story or any of these monotheistic
Well,
characters?
John Cobb, who was David Griffin's teacher, and wonderful theologian, philosopher, has a book. I think it's called A New Christology. What is it called? The Pluralistic. It's one of his very early books, but it's a Christology. But it's based on a considerably different way of conceiving uh, the being of Christ. But I was trying to think what John, when I've talked with him, he's less he's le- his interest in Jesus is the sort of the simple things that Jesus was teaching, like love your enemy and not seeking wealth. And what is the other one? It's like three basic things, do unto others.
Mm,
And the context he places them in is that Jesus was trying to find a way for their community to get along, to survive better under Roman occupation, instead of the continual problems that had happened for being kicked out, being persecuted. And so loving your enemy was sort of a way of smoothing things out, and so he sees Jesus as a historical figure. He's also very big on Abba, that Jesus referred to God as Father. And he
mm,
likes the word Abba, which I guess would have been the original thing, because it has sort of like a papa feel to it. And that somebody, you could love and trust. And he likes that general framework. Um, but I think there's some thought too that, the way that our experience continues to influence the future, that Christ was, and I suppose you'd say the Buddha, there's certain figures in the past who have had, that were enormously powerful spiritual presences. And so much so that their influence continues on, through time and broadens out and can still be felt in not only derivatively, but in some ways directly today. And so, people one of the people in our group, the holotropic breathwork group, was Jewish. And she had this extremely powerful experience of Jesus on the cross and blood, and she converted to Christianity. So, I
mm.
mean, it's For people who haven't had powerful non-ordinary experiences, things like that are quite telling. That these things can be, really life-changing.
Hmm. And why do you think evil exists in our world? If there is a God, why does he allow evil and suffering and, genocide and all these really terrible things? Why does he let it happen? You talked about it, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And my teacher, David Griffin, has several books on the problem of evil. A
Hmm.
theodicy, I believe,
Hmm.
is the technical term. And there's the natural evil. Volcanoes happen and people are, buried under ash and destroyed. And, that's just, that's the natural world. And I mean, the general picture is what I was saying earlier, is that God influences the world, but does not control it. And I think one thing Hartshorne puts it is that in a universe that has real freedom and self-determination as part of what's built into the inhabitants of that universe, then you're going to have clashes. You're going to have different needs and demands and wishes. So there's that's I mean, if God controlled everything, then it might not be evil, but there wouldn't be anything. We would be robots. So to have real freedom and self-determination, which is how the Whitehedian vision is that every occasion has its own modicum of creativity, of novelty and of self-determination. And Adam, it's minuscule. Just it.
Hmm.
That's actually what it says. That's one of the great things, is the fact that atoms don't change much, because that allows the rest of the universe to build and make more complex things. If they were changing all the time, there wouldn't be a
Hmm.
substructure, so to speak.
Hmm.
But as you get into the more and more complex things, then the ability of self-determination and choice becomes more and more powerful. And if God influences things but doesn't control them, then people do bad things. And if God doesn't control germs, sometimes germs mutate into things that are bad. And so sometimes I mean, viruses, as it turns out, isn't we're largely viruses and bacteria. So without those, we wouldn't be around. So evil is what happens in just a very complex universe with freedom and I wrote a chapter in. Do you know Thomas J. Ord? Does that ring a bell?
Hmm.
He's written this is his topic of conversation, is why bad things happen, in the world. And he's written a bunch of books. And he's got a thing called, what is it? I mean, his take on it is basically Whitehedian, that God is as powerful as God can be in this kind of universe, but God only acts through love.
Hmm.
That's how God acts, is trying to make things better for us, suggesting things better, but whether we take that up or not is our choice. And so I responded saying, yeah, but if God is entering into our experience, and we think that there's in effect a parapsychological influence between events, and God is like unimaginably more powerful than we are, wouldn't you think that God would have almost unimaginably more powerful parapsychological ability and be able to influence us more? And I didn't. He responded, but not much. And I've asked other people about this, and they say, well, God can't do that because God's everywhere. And I say, well, yeah, but I affect my body, and I'm isn't there sort of heal anyway? So I think it's a complicated. I think it's a complicated topic. As with almost everything, if you go deep enough into it, problems problems arise, or you know
Hmm.
and a lot of people are very big on pointing out that Whitehead was wasn't trying to develop the ultimate answer to everything. He was working at providing tentative, temporary ideas that are valuable, and then people will work on that in the future and come up with better ones.
Mm.
But he's the best one I've found so far.
Okay. Um, you- let's end it with Grof's stuff, the transpersonal stuff. You talk about these different stages that Grof has in his cartography of transpersonal experience, and there seems to be these three different experiences and transpersonal experiences of God. The first one is the demiurge. Then there's the cosmic consciousness, and then the supra void.
Supercosmic or metacosmic void.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he says those are very, very rare experiences, but I think he sees them as the ultimate penetrations into the depths of the universe. I actually wrote something down because it's in my book I talk about how Grof's descriptions of these experiences parallel Whitehead's ideas of the primordial and consequent natures of God. Let me just read the furthest reaches of Grof's transpersonal categories appear to involve encounters with aspects of God's dual natures and creativity. Well, I'm not, I hate reading stuff. The primordial nature is this vast reservoir of possibility and potential. Should emphasize that Whitehead, this is an abstraction. In the same way that we have an unconscious and conscious experience, it's still all us. It's not like these are separate beings or something. It's for analytic purposes only that he separates them. But so the primordial nature is this. Actually calls it a graded envisagement, which means that God has certain possibilities and potentialities that God would favor over other ones that would like to see actualized in the universe. And it's this unconscious bed of potential. And then there's the consequent nature, which is the sort of the full ongoing conscious part that's interacting with the world. And although we're also feeling that potential, so that's why I don't like to separate them quite that way. And in Grof's categories, the demiurge is the sort of the creator, this constant creation, and the primordial nature is the what does he call it? The aboriginal instance of creativity. So that's sort of it's all possible creative possibility, and so that and then being actualized through God's consequent nature. So I think these experiences of the demiurge is sensing that sheer creative possibility and potential, and the universal mind or cosmic consciousness very easily is seen as this consequent nature. That's this pervasive experience, that's conscious experience of God that's flowing in and out of all our occasions.
Mm.
And then the metacosmic void is quite interesting. I think that he again describes it as this realm of pure potential with it contains all possibility yet is abstract or not in some way, which is a perfect description of the primordial nature as this it's all possibility, unactualized possibility.
Mm.
So when I was reading Whitehead, and so it's such a I think quite a great correlation between that people are having these really deep experiences of the the ultimate realms of reality. And they fit very well Whitehead's description of as he envisions what God might be like.
Hmm.
There's a wonderful line. It's something like Grof says something like at the end that that somehow or other these aspects of this pure potential and this super consciousness are somehow other both the same thing. And I thought, well, that's perfect. God's dual natures are really the same thing. And I say I really need to show the quotations to show how closely they correlate. But I don't know if in my experience, I guess would have been sort of approaching this intense consciousness of some sort. And should well, these experiences, I think Grof thinks they're quite rare. Although now that people are taking DMT, apparently they're happening all the time.
Mm.
You just need an intense enough stimulant to get there.
Yeah, apparently it takes you straight there with a enough of a dose. Was Groff not doing anything with DMT or what was it, LSD mostly?
I think what he was using in his research was, I think, almost always LSD when in Czechoslovakia and in Maryland. I believe he himself may have encountered DMT along the way, however, um, I think he may have shared an anecdote or two that I don't feel like I should probably share.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Definitely want to keep that privacy. Yeah.
Yeah, he's as I said, he's really he's funny. He's just, I mean, he's really a very sweet. I mean, he's brilliant. He's just a very sweet guy. But when you meet him initially, he's this large. He's this big. He's a big person
Yeah.
and has this very powerful presence. And I've seen this happen with a lot of people. You go up and you ask him some question, and he kind of looks away, and and then he answers in something that doesn't seem to have any bearing at all on the question you ask.
Oh my gosh.
It's it's uh, it's uh, it's so interesting, so interesting.
So he's just kind of like daydreaming all the time and just
Well, no, it isn't daydream. I think it stimulates some other thought for him,
yeah, yeah.
which he sees as important. You wanted a specific question, you answer to a specific question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think he feels as compelled as some of us are to address the exact thing that's been presented.
Hmm. Just one more thing to touch on. I think what Tolle says, Eckhart Tolle, is that there is only one consciousness, and that just like a wave at the end of the shore, it's a wave that compares itself to other waves, and it goes through all this suffering, and then when it finally goes away, it realizes it's part of the ocean. That sounds very poetic, but that sounds very much like a monism, or is in line at least with something of that sort, that there really is one, and that one kind of splits itself. I mean, that's very close to analytic idealism, that we are just kind of these splits of one mind at large, and we kind of join in with that mind at large after death. And it sounds like Whitehead, it would fit into a Whitehedian scheme too.
Partly, try to think the term uses. David Griffin distinguishes between there's a monism in Whitehead in that everything is experience, but there's also a pluralism in that there's an infinite amount of experiences, of different experiences, which I like, because otherwise, when you've got the way, well, we're really all the same consciousness. I feel like that just blurs away all the distinctions, which are, I think, are at least as important as, the many are as important as the one. Um, and, in a sense, if you picture that, we're each new occasion emerges out of this incredible, depth of experience and God's own experience. We are emerging, out of this ocean, the term that somebody uses, ocean of feeling. I like that. We're emerging out of this ocean of feeling and then, flowing back into it. But, we also are having, our own experience, which is, in its moment of becoming is its own thing. So I don't like to overemphasize that, that everything's this, I don't like to homogenize things. I like the pluralistic aspect of it also.
Hmm. Hmm.
I didn't mean to diss Eckhart Tolle before, by the way.
Yeah,
He was, I loved his
yeah.
book, and and he's, I don't, well, I haven't met any, gurus who gone to see spiritual masters per se. So I don't know what it's like. Stan tells a story about meeting Muktananda, who was Christina's kind of guru, and had a very powerful, he kicked him a few times, gave him some candy, and got his, Shakti going, and he had a very powerful experience. So,
Hmm.
but Eckhart Tolle, got me vibrating.
On the eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, I give him
Yeah.
credit.
Yeah. Okay. John, this is an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you giving us all this wonderful knowledge. Is there anything you want to leave the viewer with? One last kind of final word before we leave?
Let, let me say I appreciate their patience, and I apologize for my occasional incoherence.
Okay. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time, maybe.
Thank you so much. That was
Yeah.
delightful.